The rain fell in sheets against the mullioned windows of Edgewick Manor as we gathered in grandfather's study for the reading of his will. Thunder punctuated the drone of legal jargon while portraits of long-dead millers watched from gilded frames. I sat apart from the others, perched on the window seat where I had spent countless childhood afternoons reading, while storms raged outside. Some things never change. To my grandson, James Miller, intoned Mr. Preston, the family attorney who had served the Millers for 3 generations, I bequeath controlling interest in Miller Pharmaceuticals, including all associated patents, properties, and financial holdings. My brother's face transformed instantly, the somber mask of mourning giving way to undisguised triumph. James had spent the past 15 years positioning himself as grandfather's successor, abandoning his own ambitions to become the heir apparent to the Miller pharmaceutical empire. His sacrifices, the medical career left behind, the strategic marriage to the daughter of our largest competitor, the carefully cultivated image of corporate responsibility, had finally paid off. It's finally mine, he whispered, though the hushed room carried his voice to every corner. Mother squeezed his hand, her face a picture of vindicated pride. Aunt Catherine dabbed at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, always the performer. Uncle William studied his fingernails with practiced indifference, though the tightness around his mouth betrayed his disappointment. No one looked at me. Why would they? I had chosen a different path, pursuing literature instead of pharmaceuticals, teaching at a small university rather than climbing corporate ladders. In the hierarchy of Miller expectations, I had failed before I'd begun. Mr. Preston cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. There is, however, a condition attached to this bequest. James's smile faltered slightly. A condition? Indeed. The attorney's expression remained neutral, though I detected something unusual in his tone, a subtle tension absent from his earlier recitations. The controlling interest in Miller Pharmaceuticals will transfer to James Miller only if he fulfills the following requirement within 1 calendar year of this reading. The study fell silent except for the persistent drumming of rain. Even the grandfather clock seemed to hold its ticking breath. James Miller must successfully manufacture and bring to market the pharmaceutical compound detailed in research files MX774, currently secured in the company vault, with clinical trials demonstrating efficacy rates of at least 85%. Something in the specific file number caused a visible reaction across the room. Mother's hand flew to her throat. Uncle William straightened in his chair. And my brother, my always composed, ever-confident brother, went completely pale. This is outrageous, James finally managed, his voice strangled. MX774 was abandoned years ago. It's impossible to develop. Mr. Preston continued as if James hadn't spoken. Should James Miller fail to meet this condition within the specified time frame, controlling interest in Miller Pharmaceuticals will transfer instead to his sister, Eleanor Miller. My name landing in the silence felt like a thunderclap. Heads swiveled toward me, expressions ranging from shock to outrage to calculation. I remained still, trying to process this unexpected twist while maintaining the composed exterior I'd perfected through years of family gatherings. There must be some mistake, Mother interjected, her aristocratic features hardening. Eleanor has no interest or experience in pharmaceuticals. She teaches English literature. Nevertheless, Mr. Preston replied, those are the explicit terms specified by Howard Miller. I can assure you the document has been thoroughly vetted for legal validity. Uncle William leaned forward, his business instincts overriding family loyalty. What happens if neither James nor Eleanor meets this condition? In that event, the company would be placed in a trust administered by the board of directors, with profits directed to the Miller Foundation for Medical Research. Mr. Preston closed the formal document. Howard was quite specific about these arrangements. James had recovered enough to shift into damage control mode. This is clearly grandfather's way of ensuring I take the company's research in the direction he valued. A challenge, not an actual threat of disinheritance. He turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. No offense, Ellie. None taken, I replied automatically, though my mind was racing. MX774 meant nothing to me, but clearly it represented something significant to the rest of the family. Something problematic enough to drain the color from my brother's face. Mr. Preston removed an envelope from his briefcase. Howard left this letter to be opened only after the will reading. It's addressed to both James and Eleanor. He placed it on the mahogany desk, then gathered his papers. I'll give you privacy to review its contents. Please contact me with any questions about the legal aspects of the will. As the attorney departed, the study's atmosphere shifted from shock to strategy. James immediately took control, moving to the desk and picking up the envelope. Before we read this, he said, directing his words to the family while barely glancing at me, let's be clear about our approach. This stays within the family. The markets would react badly to any suggestion of instability in Miller leadership. Agreed, Uncle William nodded. The condition should be treated as a formality, not a genuine contingency. I watched this familiar dynamic unfold. The closing of ranks, the immediate focus on appearances and market perception, rather than the actual situation. In typical Miller fashion, they were already constructing the narrative that would protect the company regardless of underlying realities. Ellie, James finally acknowledged me directly. I trust you understand the sensitivity here. The unspoken request was clear. Play along, don't make waves, accept your traditional role as the family outsider who poses no threat to established power structures. I understand sensitivity, I replied carefully, but I'd like to understand the actual situation first. What exactly is MX774, and why did everyone react as if grandfather had set an impossible task? An uncomfortable silence followed. Mother and Aunt Catherine exchanged glances, while Uncle William studied the rain-lashed windows with sudden interest. James tore open the envelope with controlled precision. Let's see what grandfather has to say before we get into details. The letter inside was handwritten on grandfather's distinctive stationery, his bold script immediately recognizable despite the slight tremor that had affected his handwriting in recent years. James and Eleanor. If Preston has followed my instructions, you now understand the condition I've attached to the Miller inheritance. Some will call this the final eccentricity of an old man. Others will recognize it as the most important decision I've made regarding the company's future. MX774 represents both the greatest potential and the deepest moral challenge in Miller Pharmaceuticals' history. We discovered it 15 years ago, a compound that showed remarkable efficacy against certain aggressive cancers, particularly those affecting children. Initial results were nothing short of miraculous. But development was halted when we realized the compound could only be derived from a rare plant found in a remote region of the Amazon rainforest, an area home to an indigenous tribe that has used the plant in their traditional medicine for centuries. Extracting and synthesizing the compound at scale would require either destroying their sacred lands or exploiting their knowledge without adequate compensation, possibly both. The company board, led by your father before his death, voted to abandon the research rather than pursue what many considered an ethically problematic path, regardless of the potential profits or even medical benefits. The decision haunted me, as I believed there might have been a middle way, one that respected Indigenous rights while still making this treatment available to children who desperately need it. Now I leave this dilemma to the next generation. The condition I've set is not merely a test of pharmaceutical skill, but of moral character and innovative thinking. How you approach this challenge will determine who is truly qualified to lead Miller Pharmaceuticals into the future. With hope for wisdom, Howard Miller. As James finished reading aloud, his expression had shifted from tension to something approaching relief. So that's it, a moral test, not the technical impossibility I feared. He looked up with renewed confidence. This is actually quite manageable. But I had caught something in grandfather's wording that suggested the situation might be more complex than James was acknowledging. The technical, ethical, and business dimensions seemed intricately intertwined in ways that would resist simple solutions. May I see the letter? I asked, extending my hand. James hesitated briefly before passing it over, a flicker of calculation crossing his features. Of course, though I'm not sure how much of the pharmaceutical context will make sense to you. The condescension was so familiar I barely registered it anymore. Instead, I focused on grandfather's words, searching for the layers of meaning that characterized his communication style. What was written between the lines might prove more important than the explicit message. The following morning found me in the university library, researching Indigenous rights and pharmaceutical patents, rather than preparing for the Victorian literature seminar I was scheduled to teach that afternoon. My students would have to settle for a discussion of Jane Eyre without my carefully crafted lecture notes. Grandfather's letter had revealed the ethical dilemma behind MX774, but something about James's quick pivot to confidence troubled me. The Miller Pharmaceuticals I knew, shaped by 3 generations of profit-focused leadership, was not an organization that typically prioritized ethical considerations over market opportunities. If developing this compound truly represented only a moral test, rather than a technical challenge, why had the company abandoned such promising research? My phone vibrated with an incoming call from Dr. Sophia Chen, a former classmate who now worked in medical research. We had maintained our friendship despite the divergence in our career paths, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss the intersection of literature and science. Ellie, I've been looking into that compound you asked about, she said without preamble. Where did you hear about MX774? It's not exactly common knowledge. Family matter, I replied vaguely. What can you tell me? It's fascinating, actually. About 15 years ago, there were rumors in the research community about Miller Pharmaceuticals discovering something revolutionary for pediatric cancers, but then everything went silent. No publications, no patent filings, nothing. This aligned with grandfather's letter, but Sophia's tone suggested there was more to the story. The plant it's derived from, Calanolide reticulata, is incredibly rare, she continued. It only grows in a specific microclimate within the Amazon basin. The indigenous people of that region, the Kamawe tribe, consider it sacred. Could it be synthesized? I asked, thinking of potential workarounds. That's where it gets complicated. The compound has a molecular structure so complex that artificial synthesis remains theoretical. Without the actual plant as starting material, production isn't currently possible with existing technology. This explained James's initial panic. The impossible task wasn't just an ethical challenge, but a genuine technical barrier. There's something else, Sophia added, her voice lowering slightly, though we were on a private call. A few years after Miller abandoned the research, several other pharmaceutical companies attempted to access the region. There were accusations of biopiracy, corporations trying to patent traditional knowledge without proper permission or compensation. What happened? International outcry, led by indigenous rights organizations. The Brazilian government eventually declared the area a protected biological and cultural preserve. Any research now requires approval from both government authorities and tribal leadership, with guaranteed benefit-sharing agreements. The picture was becoming clearer. Developing MX774 would require navigating not just complex ethical considerations, but international regulations, indigenous rights claims, and technical challenges in extraction and synthesis, all within the 1-year time frame grandfather had specified. One more thing, Sophia said. Your family's company wasn't the only one to abandon research in this area. Every major pharmaceutical corporation that investigated similar compounds eventually walked away, despite the potential market value. That's unusual in an industry that typically pursues profitable treatments aggressively. After ending the call, I sat surrounded by research materials, contemplating the implications. This wasn't simply a test of James's moral character. It was a nearly impossible challenge that combined ethical, legal, technical, and business barriers. Why had grandfather set such a condition, knowing it might result in leadership passing to me, someone who had deliberately chosen a path outside the family business? My phone buzzed with a text from James. Family meeting at headquarters, 3 p.m. Your presence required. Car will pick you up at 2:30. The commanding tone was typical James. No question about my availability or interest, simply an expectation of compliance with family demands. Under normal circumstances, I might have pushed back or made an excuse, but curiosity about MX774 and grandfather's intentions outweighed my usual resistance to being summoned. As predicted, a sleek black sedan arrived precisely at 2:30. The driver navigated through afternoon traffic toward the gleaming Miller Pharmaceuticals tower downtown, a building I had visited only for obligatory family events, despite its prominence in the city skyline. The executive conference room on the top floor offered panoramic views of the city, though none of the assembled family members seemed interested in the vista. James stood at the head of the table, flanked by Mother and Uncle William. Aunt Catherine sat slightly apart, examining her manicured nails with studied disinterest. 2 unfamiliar men in expensive suits completed the tableau, their expressions professionally neutral. Eleanor, James acknowledged my arrival with a nod. Thank you for coming. These gentlemen are Mr. Hargrove from Legal and Dr. Patterson, our research director. I took the only remaining seat, directly opposite James at the table's far end, a positioning that felt deliberately designed to emphasize my outsider status. We've spent the morning reviewing the MX774 situation, James continued without preamble. While challenging, it's not insurmountable. We've developed a comprehensive strategy to meet grandfather's condition within the specified time frame. The confidence in his voice didn't quite mask the tension around his eyes. Whatever strategy they had concocted, James wasn't as certain of its success as he wanted to appear. I've arranged a research expedition to Brazil next week, he announced. Dr. Patterson will lead our scientific team while Mr. Hargrove handles the legal and diplomatic aspects of accessing the protected region. And the Kamawe tribe? I asked. What arrangements have been made with them? A flicker of annoyance crossed James's face at my interruption. We're pursuing multiple channels of communication with tribal representatives. Translation: they had no established relationship or agreement with the indigenous people whose cooperation would be essential. Our legal team has already drafted benefit-sharing agreements that exceed international standards, Mr. Hargrove added smoothly. We're confident these will be received favorably. The presumption was breathtaking. Predefined agreements drafted without consultation, presented as generous offerings rather than necessary negotiations with equal partners. And synthesis? I pressed, drawing on my morning's research. I understand artificial production remains a significant technical barrier. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. We have promising approaches, though certainly challenges remain. With adequate samples of the original plant material, we believe we can develop a modified extraction process that would be both efficient and sustainable. The hesitation before his final words suggested their definition of sustainable might differ significantly from the Kamawe tribes. I see, I said simply, unwilling to challenge them directly until I better understood all dimensions of the situation. And my role in this process? James exchanged glances with Mother before responding. Your involvement isn't necessary for the operational aspects. We simply wanted to keep you informed, as a courtesy. And to ensure your cooperation, Uncle William added bluntly, the markets cannot know about this condition in Grandfather's will. Any suggestion of uncertainty in Miller leadership would be devastating to share prices. The subtext was clear. Stay quiet, stay out of the way, and pretend this competition for control doesn't exist. Play the role of the disinterested academic while we handle the real business. Of course, I replied with deliberate ambiguity. I appreciate being kept informed. As the meeting concluded with discussion of logistical details for the Brazil expedition, I remained silent, observing the familiar family dynamics at play. James controlled the narrative, Mother provided unwavering support, Uncle William focused on financial implications, and Aunt Catherine maintained her position as the family cynic, offering occasional barbed comments, but no substantive opposition. None of them had asked the question that continued to puzzle me. Why had Grandfather established this particular condition, knowing how unlikely its successful fulfillment might be? And why name me, specifically, as the alternative inheritor if James failed? The university's small archive room smelled of dust and aging paper as I carefully examined the journals, letters, and photographs that constituted Howard Miller's personal collection. Grandfather had donated these materials 5 years earlier, a gesture I had interpreted at the time as support for my academic career, one of the few acknowledgments he had ever offered for my chosen path. Now I wondered if there had been another purpose behind the donation. Placing these personal papers in a university archive rather than keeping them in family storage meant they remained accessible to me regardless of corporate politics or family interventions. Most of the collection consisted of business correspondence and research notes from Grandfather's early career, historically significant for pharmaceutical scholars, but revealing little about MX774 specifically. However, a small leather journal dated 15 years earlier caught my attention. The entries coincided with the period when the compound had been discovered and subsequently abandoned. March 12th, extraordinary preliminary results from the Amazonian samples. Patterson can barely contain his excitement. Could be the breakthrough we've sought for decades in pediatric oncology. Board meeting scheduled for next week to discuss accelerated development timeline. March 20th, ethical complications emerging. The source plant is rare and grows exclusively on Kamawe tribal lands. James Sr., my father, insists we pursue standard acquisition protocols. Buy land rights, relocate inhabitants if necessary, standard compensation packages. Something about this approach troubles me deeply. April 3rd, met with Dr. Elena Vasquez, anthropologist specializing in Amazonian indigenous cultures. Her insights regarding the Kamawe people's relationship with their land and medicine are profound. This cannot be approached as a simple transaction. The Western pharmaceutical model seems suddenly inadequate, even colonial in its assumptions. April 10th, heated board meeting. Presented alternative development approach involving partnership with Kamawe healers, collaborative research protocols, shared intellectual property rights, resistance from majority of board, particularly James Sr., who called it academic idealism with no place in pharmaceutical business. Vote scheduled for next week. April 17th, board voted 8-2 to pursue conventional development strategy. Only William and I dissented. I fear we are making a terrible mistake. Ethically, culturally, and ultimately commercially. These communities have survived for centuries by protecting their knowledge. They will not simply surrender it for our profit. The entries continued, documenting grandfather's growing concern as the company proceeded with plans to secure land rights and patents without meaningful consultation with the Kamawe. Then came a significant entry. May 30th, expedition team returned empty-handed. Kamawe elders refused access to the sacred groves where the plant grows. When our representatives attempted to collect samples anyway, local authorities intervened. International Indigenous rights organizations already mobilizing. James Sr. furious, blaming interference from activist groups rather than recognizing our own flawed approach. June 15th, board voted today to abandon MX774 development, citing insurmountable access issues and regulatory complications. The real problem was our failure to approach this opportunity with respect and genuine partnership, a potentially life-saving treatment now lost because we couldn't transcend our extractive business model. June 20th, James Sr. instructed all MX774 research materials to be archived under restricted access. A dead end not worth pursuing, he called it. I disagreed, but was outvoted. Made private copies of key research data. Something tells me this story isn't finished. The final relevant entry came months later, after my father's unexpected death from a heart attack. September 8th, attended conference on Indigenous knowledge and medical innovation. Met Rafael Mendes, Brazilian ethnobotanist, working directly with Kamawe healers on cooperative research protocols. His approach embodies everything I tried unsuccessfully to advocate within Miller Pharmaceuticals. We spoke at length about MX774 potential. He believes the Kamawe would be open to development under truly respectful partnership model. Exchanged contact information. Perhaps there is still a path forward, though not one Miller Pharmaceuticals is currently willing to consider. This entry was followed by a pressed leaf, carefully preserved between wax paper, and a business card taped to the journal page. Dr. Rafael Mendes, Instituto de Pesquisas Amazónicas, with an email address and phone number. I sat back, processing this new information. Grandfather's journal revealed a profound disagreement about business ethics and Indigenous relationships that had divided the company leadership, with my father representing the conventional pharmaceutical approach and grandfather advocating a more progressive partnership model. The mention of Rafael Mendes particularly intrigued me. If he had established genuine relationships with the Kamawe people, he might represent a path toward developing MX774 that honored Indigenous rights rather than exploiting them. A path that James, following our father's business philosophy, would be unlikely to consider. I carefully photographed the relevant journal entries and the contact information for Dr. Mendes. Before leaving the archive, I examined the pressed leaf again, wondering if it might be a sample of the very plant at the center of this inheritance challenge. Its distinctive pattern of veins and unusual serrated edge seemed significant, though I lacked the botanical knowledge to identify it. As I stepped outside, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Miller Pharmaceuticals announces major research initiative in Brazilian rainforest. James was wasting no time in pursuing his strategy. A strategy that, according to grandfather's journals, might be repeating the same mistakes that had doomed the project 15 years earlier. I hesitated only briefly before composing an email to Dr. Rafael Mendes, introducing myself and requesting a conversation about collaborative research approaches with Indigenous communities. If James was determined to pursue the path our father had championed, perhaps I needed to explore the alternative approach grandfather had advocated, not necessarily to claim the inheritance, but to ensure that whatever happened with MX774, it would honor both medical potential and Indigenous rights. Dr. Rafael Mendes responded to my email with surprising promptness, suggesting a video call that same evening. As the connection established, I found myself facing a man in his early 60s with sun-weathered skin and alert eyes that assessed me through wire-rimmed glasses. Ms. Miller, he greeted me with a slight Portuguese accent. This is unexpected but not unwelcome. Your grandfather spoke of you occasionally during our correspondence. You maintained contact with him? This was news to me. For many years, yes. Howard was a rare voice of ethical perspective in an industry not known for prioritizing Indigenous rights over profit potential. He studied me curiously. May I ask what prompts your interest in this topic now, after his passing? I explained the situation concisely. Grandfather's will condition, the competing inheritance claims, and James's expedition plans. Mendes listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. This is concerning, he said when I finished. Your brother's approach mirrors the failed strategy from 15 years ago. The Kamawe are even more protective of their knowledge and resources now, after numerous exploitation attempts by pharmaceutical and cosmetic companies. What alternative exists? I asked. If the compound truly has the medical potential grandfather believed, simply abandoning it seems wrong too. Mendez nodded approvingly. Precisely the perspective your grandfather eventually adopted. The solution isn't abandonment, but transformation of the research and development model itself. He leaned forward. The Kamawe aren't opposed to sharing their medicinal knowledge. They object to having it extracted, patented, and commercialized without their participation, control, and benefit. What would a respectful approach look like? First, recognition that the Kamawe are knowledge holders and innovators, not merely sources of raw materials. Second, research protocols developed collaboratively, respecting their cultural frameworks and priorities. Third, genuine benefit sharing that acknowledges their intellectual contribution, not just token payments for access. This approach aligned with grandfather's journal entries, but seemed radically different from standard pharmaceutical practice. Certainly different from how James would approach the challenge. Is such a model commercially viable? I asked, thinking of the 1-year development timeline grandfather had specified. That's the critical question, isn't it? Mendez smiled slightly. The conventional pharmaceutical view would say no. The profit margins would be reduced, development timelines extended, control diluted. But consider the alternative. Millions spent on failed expeditions, legal battles, reputation damage, and ultimately no product at all. Which is truly more viable. He had a point. The traditional approach had already failed once and seemed likely to fail again, given strengthened Indigenous rights protections and increased international scrutiny. There's something else you should know, Mendez added, his expression turning more serious. The plant containing the compound your company identified as MX774 is becoming increasingly rare. Climate change and logging pressures have reduced its habitat significantly. The Kamawe have been cultivating it ceremonially for generations, but they're struggling to maintain populations in the wild. This added yet another dimension to the challenge, an environmental urgency beyond the medical potential. I'm traveling to Brazil next week to work with the Kamawe on a habitat restoration project, Mendez continued. If you're serious about exploring an alternative approach, you would be welcome to join me. Your presence, as Howard Miller's granddaughter, but also as someone outside the pharmaceutical industry, might open conversations that would remain closed to your brother's expedition team. The invitation was unexpected, but compelling. My academic calendar showed a brief break between terms, timing that seemed almost too convenient, as if grandfather had anticipated this possibility when establishing his 1-year timeline. What would my role be? I asked, already mentally rearranging my schedule. Observer, initially. Perhaps bridge builder eventually, if the Kamawe elders are receptive. Mendez regarded me thoughtfully. I should warn you, this isn't a luxury research expedition. Accommodations will be basic, conditions challenging, and your brother may view your involvement as direct competition for the inheritance. He was right about James. Any independent action I took regarding MX774 would be interpreted as a challenge, regardless of my actual intentions. The family dynamics would become even more complicated than they already were. Yet something about this opportunity resonated deeply, not just as a potential path to developing an important medical treatment, but as a chance to honor grandfather's ethical concerns while forging connections across cultural divides. My literature background had always focused on understanding diverse perspectives and finding meaning across differences. Perhaps those skills had more practical application than I had realized. I'll make arrangements to join you, I decided. But I should be transparent. I'm not a scientist or pharmaceutical expert. My background is literary analysis and cultural studies. Mendez smiled. Perfect. We have plenty of scientists. What this situation needs is someone who understands narratives, who can translate between worldviews. That may prove more valuable than any technical expertise. As our call concluded with logistical details for the journey, I realized I had just committed to a path that would inevitably bring me into conflict with James and the family power structure. Whether I was truly pursuing the inheritance or simply exploring the ethical approach grandfather had advocated, the distinction would be meaningless to James. In his view, I had just declared war. The small propeller plane descended toward a clearing that barely qualified as an airstrip, surrounded by verdant rainforest stretching to the horizon. After commercial flights to Manaus and a smaller charter to the research station at the edge of the protected Kamawe territory, this final leg of the journey had brought the reality of my decision into sharp focus. I was literally and figuratively far from my comfortable academic world, venturing into territory where James's corporate resources and connections held no particular advantage. Dr. Mendez pointed out key geographical features as we approached: the river system that defined Kamawe territories, the subtle variations in forest canopy that indicated different ecological zones, and the small settlement where we would be based. A collaborative research station established through years of relationship building between scientists and indigenous communities. The Kamawe village is another 2 hours by boat, he explained as we disembarked into humid heat that immediately fogged my glasses. We'll meet with the research team today and travel to the village tomorrow if the elders approve our visit. The research station proved more developed than I had expected. Solar panels providing electricity, satellite internet connecting this remote outpost to global scientific networks, and laboratory facilities equipped for botanical analysis and preservation. The team included Brazilian researchers, 2 European ethnobotanists, and several Kamawe community members who served as both guides and co-investigators, rather than merely local assistants. Our approach centers indigenous knowledge systems rather than extracting from them, explained Dr. Lucia Santos, the station director, as she showed me around. Traditional healing practices contain sophisticated understanding of plant properties and applications developed over centuries. Our goal is complementary research that respects both scientific and traditional methods. This collaborative model stood in stark contrast to the expeditionary approach James was likely pursuing, arriving with corporate resources and legal documents, seeking to extract valuable compounds for development within Western pharmaceutical frameworks. I wondered if his team had even reached Brazil yet, or if they were still navigating the complex permit processes for accessing protected territories. That evening, over a simple dinner with the research team, Dr. Mendez raised the subject of MX774 directly. Eleanor's grandfather identified a compound 15 years ago with significant potential for treating pediatric cancers, he explained to the assembled researchers. The source plant grows exclusively in Kamawe territory. Previous attempts to develop it failed because the approach disregarded indigenous rights and knowledge. Dr. Santos nodded. I remember this case. Miller Pharmaceuticals, yes? It became something of a cautionary tale in ethical research circles. My brother is currently attempting to revive the research, I acknowledged, though I fear he's employing the same approaches that failed previously. The plant you're referring to, we know it as Aiwa'a, has become increasingly rare, contributed Paulo, one of the Kamawe researchers. Our healers cultivate it ceremonially, but wild populations have declined significantly due to changing rain patterns and increased logging pressure along territorial boundaries. This confirmed what Mendez had mentioned during our video call. Environmental pressures were creating additional urgency beyond the medical potential. What makes this compound particularly valuable from a medical perspective? I asked, trying to better understand the technical aspects that had been omitted from family discussions. Dr. Santos retrieved her tablet and displayed molecular diagrams. The compound has a unique mechanism for targeting cancer cells while leaving healthy tissue unaffected, something of a holy grail in oncology research. Preliminary tests showed remarkable efficacy against aggressive pediatric cancers that currently have poor treatment outcomes. The problem isn't efficacy, but ethical sourcing and production, added Dr. Mendez. The compound's complex structure makes laboratory synthesis extremely difficult without the original plant material as a starting point. And the Kamawe, understandably, are unwilling to allow commercial harvesting that might threaten both the plant's survival and their traditional relationship with it. Is there no middle ground? I asked. Some approach that respects Kamawe rights and knowledge while making the treatment available to children who need it? Paulo exchanged glances with Dr. Mendez before responding. There might be. Our healers have been cultivating Aiwa'a for generations, using methods that maintain its medicinal properties while ensuring sustainable harvests. But these practices are considered sacred knowledge, not to be shared without proper protocols and relationships, which is why standard corporate approaches fail, Dr. Mendez concluded. They seek transactional solutions to relationship challenges. As the conversation continued into the evening, I gained deeper appreciation for the complexity grandfather had recognized 15 years earlier. The challenge wasn't simply technical or legal, but fundamentally cultural, requiring translation between knowledge systems and value frameworks that operated from different core assumptions. Later, as I prepared for sleep in the simple but comfortable quarters assigned to me, my phone briefly caught enough satellite signal to download waiting messages. Among them was a terse text from James. Aware of your Brazil trip. This isn't a game, Eleanor. Corporate legal team advises your interference could invalidate both our claims to inheritance. Return immediately. The threat was clear, but remarkably empty. Nothing in grandfather's condition prevented me from pursuing my own approach to MX774 development. James's legal warning was a bluff designed to maintain his control of the situation. Control that was slipping as I explored alternatives he hadn't considered. I drafted a simple reply before the signal faded again. Not interfering. Exploring collaborative approaches that might succeed where conventional methods failed. Perhaps we should compare notes rather than compete. The olive branch was sincere, though I harbored few illusions about James's willingness to consider methodologies that challenged his business assumptions. Like our father before him, he viewed pharmaceutical development through a lens of property rights, market exclusivity, and profit maximization, a framework fundamentally at odds with the knowledge-sharing traditions of the Kamawe. As I drifted towards sleep, lulled by unfamiliar rainforest sounds, I reflected on how thoroughly grandfather had constructed this inheritance challenge. By specifying MX774 development as the condition, he had created a situation that required engaging with precisely the ethical questions that had divided the family 15 years earlier. Whether intentionally or not, he had designed a test that measured not just pharmaceutical expertise, but moral imagination and cross-cultural understanding, qualities James had never particularly valued or cultivated. The Kamawe village revealed itself gradually as our boats rounded a river bend, structures of local materials blending harmoniously with the surrounding forest rather than imposing upon it. We were met at the shore by a welcoming committee led by Elder Iara, a woman whose dignified bearing and penetrating gaze commanded immediate respect despite her diminutive stature. Dr. Mendez introduced me in Portuguese, which another community member translated into the Kamawe language. I was identified not primarily as a Miller Pharmaceuticals representative, but as Howard Miller's granddaughter, carrying forward his interest in respectful research collaboration. "We remember Howard Miller," Elder Iara responded through the translator. "He visited many years ago, after the company people came with their papers and promises. He listened when others only spoke." This revelation surprised me. Grandfather had never mentioned personally visiting the Kamawe territories. His journal entries had described meetings with anthropologists and research conferences, but not direct engagement with the community. "The Aiwa'a matter brings others from your family's company again," Elder Iara continued. "They arrived at the territorial boundary yesterday with government officials and legal documents. We have refused them entry while we consult with the spirits and ancestors." James's expedition had reached Brazil more quickly than I had anticipated. His approach, arriving with official representatives and legal authority, contrasted sharply with our small group being received as guests rather than claimants. "I'm not here to make demands or present documents," I clarified. "I'm here to listen and understand if there might be a path forward that honors both Kamawe wisdom and the medicine's potential to help children far from here." Elder Iara studied me carefully before responding. "Words of respect are easily spoken. Your grandfather said similar things, yet his company still sought to take without proper relationship. How are you different?" The directness of her question cut through diplomatic niceties. How indeed was I different? I had no pharmaceutical expertise, no corporate authority, and until recently, no particular interest in MX774 development. What did I bring that could possibly matter in this context? "I cannot speak for Miller Pharmaceuticals," I answered honestly. "My brother leads the company and approaches this matter differently than I would. What I offer is a commitment to finding a third path, neither exploitation nor abandonment of the medicine's potential. But I don't presume to know what that path looks like without your guidance." My academic training had taught me to construct carefully reasoned arguments supporting predetermined positions. Here, that approach felt not just inadequate, but inappropriate. Instead, I found myself in a space of genuine uncertainty, offering openness rather than solutions. Elder Iara conferred briefly with other community leaders before responding. "Tomorrow we will show you the Aiwa'a Groves and explain its place in our understanding. Then we will discuss what might be possible." That evening, as the community shared a meal with our research team, I received an urgent message from Dr. Santos, who had remained at the research station. James had secured a court order demanding access to Kamawe territory for scientific research of significant public health interest. Government representatives would escort his team into the protected area the following day, regardless of community objections. The legal maneuver reflected exactly the approach our father had advocated 15 years earlier, using institutional power to override Indigenous sovereignty when negotiations proved challenging. It might secure short-term access but would destroy any possibility of meaningful partnership. I sought out Elder Iara immediately, sharing this development with transparent concern. My brother believes legal authority can substitute for earned trust. I disagree with his approach but have no corporate power to stop it. To my surprise, her response held neither anger nor alarm. We have faced such papers and officials before. They may enter our territory but will not find what they seek. The Iwa reveals itself only to those it chooses. Her confidence suggested dimensions to this situation beyond Western legal frameworks, cultural and spiritual understandings that James's expedition was ill-equipped to navigate. There is another approach, she continued after a thoughtful pause, one that Howard Miller and I discussed many years ago, though his company rejected it then. If you truly seek a different path than your brother, come with me at dawn. There are things you must understand that cannot be explained, only experienced. As I returned to my assigned quarters, I realized that grandfather's inheritance challenge had created precisely this opportunity, a moment where fundamentally different approaches to knowledge, medicine, and relationship would be tested simultaneously. James with his court orders and corporate resources, me with nothing but willingness to listen and learn. The outcome would determine not just who inherited Miller Pharmaceuticals, but what kind of company it might become. And perhaps more importantly, whether a truly life-saving treatment could emerge from the contested space between different knowledge systems and ethical frameworks. At dawn, I would need to choose which inheritance truly mattered, the corporate power grandfather had conditionally offered, or the ethical vision he had unsuccessfully championed within the company he built. Perhaps, if I was fortunate, there might be a path that honored both. 1 year to the day after the will reading, we gathered once again in grandfather's study at Edgewick Manor. The same portraits watched from gilded frames, the same grandfather clock marked time with solemn precision, but nearly everything else had changed. Mr. Preston arranged his papers with characteristic meticulousness, though the slight upward curve of his mouth suggested he anticipated the coming proceedings with something approaching satisfaction. Mother sat rigidly beside James, whose confident facade had acquired a brittle quality over the preceding months. Uncle William studied financial reports with feigned absorption, while Aunt Catherine had abandoned all pretense of disinterest, watching the assembled family with open curiosity. I took my usual window seat, now flanked by Dr. Mendez and Elder Iara, whose presence in this bastion of pharmaceutical wealth represented perhaps the most profound change of all. As stipulated in Howard Miller's last will and testament, Mr. Preston began, we are assembled to determine whether the condition attached to the bequest of controlling interest in Miller Pharmaceuticals has been satisfied. Specifically, whether James Miller has successfully manufactured and brought to market the pharmaceutical compound detailed in research files MX774, with clinical trials demonstrating efficacy rates of at least 85%. James straightened, presenting a folder of documents. Miller Pharmaceuticals has successfully developed and patented a synthetic variant of the MX774 compound, with preliminary clinical trials showing efficacy rates of 87% in treatment-resistant pediatric cancers. FDA approval for compassionate use has been granted while full approval proceeds through standard protocols. Pride and defiance mingled in his voice. He had accomplished what the company had deemed impossible 15 years earlier, navigating technical, legal, and regulatory hurdles within the specified timeframe. By conventional metrics, he had fulfilled grandfather's condition and secured his inheritance. The documentation appears to be in order, Mr. Preston acknowledged, reviewing the materials. However, there is an additional consideration that must be addressed before confirming satisfaction of Howard's condition. James's expression tightened. What additional consideration? The condition specified development and efficacy benchmarks, both of which have been met. Mr. Preston removed an envelope from his briefcase, similar to the one grandfather had left after the original will reading, but previously unseen. Howard left this with me, to be opened only at today's determination meeting. It contains his final clarification regarding the MX774 condition. The attorney broke the seal and read aloud. The development of MX774 was never merely a technical or commercial challenge, but an ethical one. True success requires not just effective medicine, but rightful relationship with the knowledge holders who made it possible. The inheritance should pass to whoever demonstrates understanding of this essential truth. James's confidence visibly faltered. That's entirely subjective. The condition as stated in the will specified measurable benchmarks, all of which have been met through legitimate scientific and legal processes. Perhaps we should review those processes, I suggested, speaking for the first time, particularly how the compound was ultimately sourced and how relationships with the Kamawe people were structured. The question hit its mark. James's approach had indeed succeeded in creating an effective treatment, but through methods that epitomized everything grandfather had criticized. Obtaining samples through legal technicalities rather than consent, filing patents that excluded Indigenous knowledge contributions, and establishing a supply chain that prioritized corporate control over collaborative stewardship. The technical requirements have been satisfied, James insisted. The rest is philosophical window dressing without legal standing. I believe Howard anticipated this very argument, Mr. Preston noted, removing a final document from his briefcase. This codicil, properly executed and witnessed, establishes that the MX-774 condition includes both technical development and ethical sourcing requirements, with particular emphasis on Indigenous rights recognition and benefit-sharing arrangements. As James absorbed this revelation with visible shock, I presented an alternative development pathway, the collaborative model established over months of genuine partnership with the Kamawe community. While James had pursued synthetic variants through conventional pharmaceutical approaches, I had facilitated a fundamentally different process, one that recognized Kamawe healers as knowledge innovators rather than merely raw material sources. The outcome was a jointly developed cultivation protocol that preserved the plant's traditional significance while allowing sustainable production, combined with a revolutionary benefit-sharing model where the Kamawe community retained partial intellectual property rights and oversight of production methods. Clinical trials had demonstrated 91% efficacy, exceeding both grandfather's benchmark and James's results. Two approaches to the same challenge, Mr. Preston summarized, both technically successful, but fundamentally different in their relationship to the knowledge source. Mother bristled with indignation. This is manipulation of the inheritance terms. James has led the company for years, preparing for this role his entire life. Eleanor has no business experience whatsoever. Perhaps that was precisely the point, Mr. Preston suggested. Howard's journals make clear his belief that pharmaceutical leadership required ethical innovation as much as technical expertise, a perspective the company had lost under conventional business leadership. As the implications settled over the room, I turned to Elder Yara and Dr. Mendez. What had begun as an inheritance challenge had evolved into something far more significant, a pioneering model for how traditional knowledge and modern science might collaborate ethically, potentially transforming not just one medication, but an entire approach to pharmaceutical development. Regardless of today's determination, I said, addressing the family directly, the partnership with the Kamawe will continue. The treatment will reach children who need it. Some inheritances transcend legal documents and corporate control. Mr. Preston nodded with something approaching approval before delivering his final determination. Based on Howard Miller's explicitly stated intentions and the comprehensive documentation provided, controlling interest in Miller Pharmaceuticals transfers to Eleanor Miller, effective immediately. The color drained from James's face, just as it had 1 year earlier when grandfather's recording had first established this unexpected condition. The empire he had spent his life preparing to lead had slipped from his grasp not through technical failure, but through fundamental misunderstanding of what grandfather had truly valued. As the formal proceedings concluded and the family dispersed in various states of shock and calculation, Elder Iara approached the portrait of grandfather that hung above the fireplace, studying it with thoughtful consideration. He learned in the end, she observed quietly, and ensured the learning would continue through you. The inheritance grandfather had designed wasn't merely about corporate control or even medical innovation, but about transforming the relationship between different knowledge systems and ethical frameworks, creating space for genuine collaboration rather than mere extraction. That perhaps was his most significant legacy, one that would continue to unfold long after today's determination had faded from memory. The rain had stopped outside Edgewick Manor, sunlight breaking through clouds that had seemed impenetrable just hours earlier. Some might call it coincidence, but Elder Yara smiled knowingly as she prepared for the journey home, back to the rainforest, where a sacred plant would continue to grow under careful stewardship, now connected to a wider world through relationship rather than exploitation. That was an inheritance worth receiving and worth sharing.